So last week we talked about believing and seeing, that even though we think seeing is believing, the reverse is actually true, that we believe in order to see. Okay? But what happens when we see, or when we look, or as the language would say it, when we behold? You know how they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder? What does that mean? Beauty is in the eye of the one who's looking / seeing, right? And they determine whether it's beautiful or not. So there is a concept, no, not it's a concept, but people say we become what we behold. True or false? That when you look at something, now I'm not saying that when you look at a chair you will become a chair, no. Sometimes we speak, language is limited. When we try to communicate certain concepts, we are limited to the few words that we know, because some things are actually beyond words, okay? And so we try and use words to convey a message, but it's not always complete. But when they say we become what we behold, it means that there's a certain exchange when your gaze is fixed on something. If you've heard of something called the social learning theory, how do kids learn? How do they absorb information? How do they become adults and grown-ups? Primarily by observation, right? They see what you do and they do it, and in that way they learn. So we can say that they become what they behold. Last week we had a family at our house, and they had a 3-year-old child who I thought was quite fascinating, or rather she thought I was fascinating, if I should say, because I would fist bump her, and sometimes when I'm standing I just like to cross my hands, and as I fist bumped her and crossed my hands, she did the same thing, okay? And the parents noticed, and they said, oh, she must really like you, because imitation is the highest form of flattery. We just met like that evening, and those words got me thinking. So as she was observing me, she began to do the things that I was doing. And who knows, maybe this is what she's doing all week, Maybe she's just fist bumping people and crossing her arms. This simple example just goes to show you that, even, these, when we're talking about child development and the ways that they learn, yes, we grow up and we become adults, but we're still learning. We're still adapting. Every environment that you go, you observe, you adjust, and you adapt, and you become. They say when you go to Rome, do as the Romans do. So in other words, they tell you observe their behavior and adapt it. So it's very, very important to know that anytime you're looking at something, we become, we adapt whatever it is that we are looking at, okay? Let's go on to the, wait, hold on, I'm not even read here. Is this going to be necessary now that I've said all that? I'll just read it, okay? Because it's good. It's not going to harm you. Remember how we said last week, believing is seeing, right? There's a scripture in Psalms 27, verse 13 that says, I had fainted. Fainting meaning I had given up. I had lost heart. I had surrendered. I had lost hope. So it says, I had fainted unless I had believed to see. You see that? Unless I had believed to see the goodness of God, of the Lord in the land of the living. What is this person saying? They're saying that I was in a situation which sometimes we all experience, where you feel like you're at your wit's end. Okay? You feel like I've been pushed to the corner and my only choice is either to give up or not, right? And this was the case in the person who wrote this scripture. It says, I had fainted. Rather, except that I made the choice, the decision to believe, listen, I was gone. I had already given up. Okay? But the language they use, it says, I had fainted unless I had believed to see. That means they got to a point where they chose, irrespective of whatever was going on around them, they made a decision, contrary to what was going on, to believe or to see better, to see beyond the situation that they're experiencing. Okay? And when we're saying these things, you can clearly see we're not talking about looking with your physical eyes, right? We already addressed this beyond in the sermon last week, right? So this person was pushed to the corner, but they had a choice whether to live or to die, and they chose to live. So he said, I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And so life puts us in these situations. Sometimes we face things, whether in our relationships, in our careers, that puts us in places where either you give up, or if you don't give up, you believe that it's going to get better. Look at how it renders it in the next version. It says, I would have despaired had I not believed. What does it mean to despair? To lose hope, right? It says, I would have despaired. Many times we're in this place. You're like, is my career going the right way? Or should I give up and just not dream anymore? Are my dreams and ambitions valid? Or should I just forget and settle for less? So he says, I would have despaired had I not believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord. What changed in that person is not the situation. What changed is their perspective. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. Nothing may have changed physically in the moment, but they chose that, you know what, it costs me nothing to believe that it will get better. So let me do that, because if I don't do that, there is no hope. Do you understand what I'm saying? And he says here, after he said that, he said, now wait for and confidently expect the Lord. And he said, be strong and let your heart take courage. He says, yes, wait and confidently expect the Lord. So after he experienced this thing and he decided to believe, he realized, wait, actually, the moment you choose to believe, certain things happen to you. He says you receive strength in your heart. And he said, as you confidently expect your salvation, listen, you will no longer be in despair. Okay? So, another version says, I won't read that version. Let's move to Colossians 3:1 and 2. Still talking about sight and vision and perspective. It says this. It says, so if you're serious about living this new resurrection life, if you're serious, if you're not serious, forget it. But if you're serious about living this new resurrection life with Christ, it says, act like it. What does that mean? Act like it. And he says here, pursue the things over which Christ presides. In other words, follow the things after which Christ is in charge of, okay? And he says, listen, still talking on eyes, don't shuffle along, eyes to the ground. In other words, don't live your life. What animal walks looking down? A chicken, I would assume, because they're always pecking for stuff on the floor, yeah? But don't go through life with your eyes looking down, or not having any vision, not having any ambition, not knowing who you are, where you are. Don't go through life defeated. That's the word. Yeah, because when you're looking down, it means you're defeated, you've despaired, you've given up. It says, don't shuffle along, eyes to the ground. It says, absorbed with the things right in front of you. You know what that condition is when people are short-sighted? Is it myopia? Yeah? Where you only see, and because of the condition, are forced to only see what's right in front of your eyes, okay? But ultimately, everyone wants to be able to see long enough or far enough, right? In the physical sense, but also in the spiritual sense, you also need to have sight beyond the now. You understand? You need to be able to know where you want to go. You need to be able to see that future before it comes. Very important, right? Do you see how we discussed that you cannot go anywhere you have not seen in your mind, right? You are coming to Manifest, you had an idea in your mind where you are coming, and so you ended up here, right? Without that idea in your mind of where you're going, or what people would call vision, the Bible says the people perish. Without vision, the people perish. Without vision, companies go bankrupt, okay? Everyone needs a vision. Everything needs a vision. And so it says, don't shuffle along, eyes to the ground, absorbed with the things right in front of you. And he says, look up. Look up. And he says, be alert to what is going on around Christ. And he says, that's where the action is. He says, see things from his perspective. Okay? Because you see, even though we are looking at the same thing, perspective really determines how we interpret the situation, right? We talked about the glass half full, half empty illustration. You know, when you have a certain perspective in life, it determines what kind of life experience you will ultimately have. So sight, vision, how you see things is super important, okay? And even as we're talking about perspective, how do you think, based on all the lessons that we've learned, how do you think God sees you? Speaking on perspective, how do you think God sees you? What's his perspective of you? Okay. Anyone else? The best version. Wow, yeah, that's beautiful. The best version of you. Anyone else with an idea? That's a genuine answer. He says he wonders what God is saying about him. Okay. You know, it's true sometimes that when you have not come to really know who God is and how he thinks, you can have these questions and anxieties concerning his perspective. But the Bible does not leave us in darkness concerning how he views us, okay? So I'm going to show us a few scriptures. I'm glad I asked that question concerning how he sees us, just to help us as we go along this path of becoming what we behold, right? It says in Isaiah 43 verse 4, it says, since you are precious in my sight, speaking of the Lord, he says, you are honored and I have loved you. And he says, therefore, I will give men for you and people for your life. God's speaking to you and telling you, listen, you are, number one, precious in my sight. You are precious in my sight. And he said, I have loved you. Okay? Very, very important when understanding how God sees you. Okay? And this is the beauty about eyes and sight and all of these things. Okay. He says, since you are precious in my sight, where is God looking? It's not a trick question. Yeah, personalize it. Right? He's looking at you. Okay? When we talk about the dynamics of eye contact, okay, if I look at someone and they're not looking at me, is there any connection? No. If you're looking at someone and they look at you, what do you call that? Eye what? Don't you think it's interesting? The eyes don't touch, right? But it's called contact. That when I look at you and you look at me, contact has been established. A rapport, a certain, it's like there is a rope now between us. When I look at you and you look at me. Don't you think it's interesting? Right? So many love songs have this line. Saw you from across the room. What connected them? Eye contact. Love at first sight. What connected them? Okay? What I'm trying to tell you is, like, sight, vision, where you're looking, is very crucial. Physically, metaphysically. Do you understand? Because it means so much, even when someone establishes eye contact. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. You think that thing that you feel when someone is looking at you and you look at them is imagined? No. There is some, I don't know what to call it, but it's there, okay? And it means something. And they've studied it, and I don't want to fill your head with stuff, so you start looking at everyone in the bus and you're like, oh, is he the one? Is he not the one? No. All I'm telling you is when you look at someone and someone looks at you, there's a difference than when someone is looking at you and you're not looking at them. Or vice versa. Or when you're looking at someone, which has happened to many of us, you're looking at someone, but they're not looking back at you. You understand? Someone will have a story to tell and another one won't because they never saw anything. You understand what I'm saying? You'll understand why I'm making this point. Speaking again about how God sees us, we said that he sees us as precious and he says that he has loved us. In Deuteronomy 32 verse 10, speaking again very metaphorically but very powerfully concerning how he sees Jacob, he says, he found him in the wilderness in an empty and windswept wasteland. And he said he threw his arms around him. God now threw his arms around him, and he says, lavished attention on him. Okay? Oh, this is so beautiful. It says, guarding him as the apple of his eye. Because that's how God sees us. He sees us as the object of his affection, the apple of his eye. You know, the object of your affection, you see, you can see many things, but the object of your affection is the thing that you like to look at. You know, some things you're forced to look at, and there are things that you like to look at. There are faces you like to see, and there are faces you have to see, and there's a difference, right? The faces that you like to see, you're looking forward to that moment when you can look at one another. And this is what this is expressing. He says he lavished attention on him, guarding him as the apple of his eye. And he says he was like an eagle hovering over the nest. And he says overshadowing its young. I like that because it's ascribing the qualities of an eagle to God, okay? But it calls us its young. So what does that mean of us? That we are also eagles. We are not chicken or duck, you know. We are of the same nature. Are you understanding what I'm saying? He says he was like an eagle hovering over its nest, overshadowing its young. Speaking on identity, how we said that you are made in his image and likeness. You understand? That's your true identity. You're not a different breed from who God is because you are made to be like him. You understand? So he says he was hovering over that nest, overshadowing its young. And he says, then spreading its wings, lifting them into the air, teaching them to fly. Just like the large eagle is flying and wants its young to learn also to fly, God is also doing the same with us. He's teaching us to fly. You understand? That's why we cannot afford to walk life shuffling our eyes to the ground, because he has called us to a higher, superior life experience. You know, the word Zoe means life as God would have it. Do you understand? Jesus said, I have come that you may have life and have life more abundantly. That word life means Zoe, which means life as God would have it. Do you understand? It's beautiful when you think about it, because sometimes instead of thinking or wondering, oh, what does God think of me? Now you know that he sees you as the apple of his eye, that you're precious in his sight. And now, to make my point that if God is looking at you, my question to you is, are you looking at him? Do you understand where I'm going with this? If his gaze is fixed on you, and you're precious in his sight, and you're the object of his affection, are you looking back? Or are you looking aside, feeling shameful and guilty? Or are you looking down, feeling inadequate? Or are you making and breaking eye contact? Do you understand what I'm saying? Because all these behaviors when it comes to eye contact mean something. Don't they tell you when you go to an interview, maintain eye contact? Why? Because even though you're not confident, you will look confident. You understand? Eye contact speaks a lot about who the person who's looking at you is. And that connection, it goes deeper than what we think. Especially if you think that we become what we behold. Now, let's go to the next part of this, because the next focus of this discussion is I want us to talk about the phrase. I don't know whether you've heard it or not, or the verse common in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, that says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. You may have heard it, you may have not. If you haven't heard it, don't worry. You're here, so you'll hear it. And you know, sometimes people ask, like, what's the value of seeing Jesus? What's the value? What does that even mean? How does that put money in my bank? How does that put food on my table? How does that solve my brokenness? How does that solve my relationship issues? How does that solve my financial issues? What is the correlation between looking at Jesus and everything else that's going on around me? In fact, it sounds a bit avoidant that you don't want to deal with things, so then you say, I'm looking to Jesus. You understand? So, and many people, not just unbelievers, even believers, you know, they take the more pragmatic approach like in the sense that like that doesn't really, it doesn't fit into the equation. Like my problem is so different. And many of times we compartmentalize our lives to think, okay, this is my faith, this is my social circle, this is my work. We assume that they are not connected, but in truth, they are all connected. Everything is connected. You understand? And so when we think about this concept, what is the value of looking to Jesus? What does that mean? How does that help us? Many people assume that it's not pragmatic, it's not practical enough because there is no apparent value add to me looking at him or whatever that means, okay, and it impacting or changing my problem, okay? But what people forget is in the process of looking into his eyes, because first he was looking at you, in the process of looking at him, that time is where miracles happen. That time is where help arrives. That's the time where whatever you thought was a problem becomes solved. I will qualify that statement by a story that I will read, okay? Because I'm sure you're wondering, how? But I will tell you why. You're not the first to think that way, okay? I'll show you why in a bit. But let's read this Hebrews 12, 1-3. This is what really I want, but I'm going to read everything so that you can know. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses who have borne the testimony of truth, it says, let us strip off and throw away aside every encumbrance, that is every unnecessary weight, and that sin which so readily deftly and cleverly clings to and entangles us, and let us run with patient endurance and steady and active persistence the appointed course of the race that is set before us. That's a mouthful, okay? And it says in the second bit, it says, looking away, but if you remove the parenthesis, you will say, it says, looking away to. Looking away to. What does that mean? What does that mean? Looking away to. Yeah, right? It says look away to. So it says look away from all that will distract. Because sometimes we have a lot of things in our line of vision. And Jesus becomes one of them. Do you understand what I'm saying? He's among the things that we are looking to, as opposed to being the thing or the person that we are looking to. So he says here, he says, looking away from all that distracts to Jesus. He says, who is the leader and the source of our faith? Okay? He says that he's giving the first incentive of our belief, and he's also the finisher, bringing it to maturity and perfection. The reason we believe is because Jesus existed, all right? And he says here, he, explaining his story, for the joy of obtaining the prize that was set before him, endured the cross, despising and ignoring the shame, and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And he says in verse 3, he says, just think of him who endured from sinners such grievous opposition and bitter hostility against himself. Reckon up and consider it all in comparison with your trials. And he says, so that you may not grow weary or exhausted, losing heart and relaxing and fainting in your minds. A lot of stuff that I've read, but he's saying, listen, when you're going through challenges, look unto him. Why? Because he experienced so much and he went through so much, but he was able to overcome. As you look at him, you not only become like him, but you're also able to conquer and overcome the trials and the troubles that you are going through. Remember how he said, I had fainted unless I had believed to see. He says here, looking away to Jesus. And he says, so that you may not grow weary, exhausted, losing heart, relaxing in the sense of giving up, fainting in your minds, because that's what happens. When so much is going on around us, because it's not energizing, because it's not giving us strength, what is it doing? It's draining us. As you're focusing on what's going on at work, what's going on home, what's going on with your neighbor. As you focus on all these things, it's literally depleting you and getting you to that point where you feel like you're about to give up. Okay? But he says, looking away from all of that. Looking away from all of that. Case in point, go to the next slide. Who did this? Who had this kind of experience that we may learn from? I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 14, the story of Peter. And I think in this story, there's a lot for us to learn in terms of the power and the value of the focus and perspective of our gaze, where we are looking. It says here, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Okay? So this is happening at some time in the night. And he says, then after the crowd had gone, Jesus went up to the mountain alone. And he says, as he had intended from the start. And he says, as evening descended, he stood alone on the mountain praying. You know, some of the things that we read and are written for us in the scriptures are for us to learn. The life that Jesus lived, he lived so that we can learn and follow, okay? So that we can watch, observe, and do. So he says he was up in the mountain praying. After everyone had gone, after he had done the miracles, he stayed back to pray. Okay? I like this version because it adds some context. It says, in the midst of the burdens of life and ministry, like when news of John's death reached him, Jesus seeks refreshment in solitary prayer. So, yeah, a lot was going on. He was doing a lot and a lot was happening. And he stayed back to connect to the source, to pray. Okay? He stayed back. Now, in that time, something interesting happened. He says in verse 24, the boat which he had sent the disciples with was on the water some distance from the land. And he says, buffeted and pushed around by waves and the wind. He says, deep in the night, when he had concluded his prayers, Jesus walked out on the water to his disciples. How many of us know the story, or at least had a reference of it? Right? It's very common. Jesus walked on water. He says, the disciples saw a figure moving toward them and were terrified. Now, to us, we read it like a story. But I don't know if you've been on a boat at night. It's interesting. I've been on a boat, like I've spent the night on a boat. Not a cruise ship. That's a different experience. Like on a 14-foot boat, you know, and it's a bit, I cannot imagine if you see a figure walking on the water at night. That will not help me to believe. You know, that will not help my faith. Because you can imagine, you're not expecting anything like that. You have never seen anything like that. Right? How many of us have tried to walk on water? It's possible. But it was not possible. Huh? Frozen, that's ice. It has a name, right? So this is the situation, setting the scene. He told them to go out so he can pray. And they went out and they're traveling on the boat, and at some point in the night they see a shadowy figure, okay? And he's walking on water. Or this figure is walking on water. Can we go to the next slide? Now, there are some conversations that happen here, and I think they're very, very interesting. Still, we are on the subject of becoming what we behold. So, the first disciple said, it's a ghost. Another disciple said, a ghost? What will we do? Now, in verse 27, Jesus speaks and says, be still. It is I. And he says, you have nothing to fear. Do they hear? No. Peter says to him, Lord, if it is really you, then command me to meet you on the water. He says, hey, I cannot verify whether it's you or not. So if it's really you, tell me to come. Now that's very, very impressive, because there are 12 disciples on the boat. Only one trusted that if it's Jesus, then he would make him do what he was doing. Do you understand? There were 12. You see, they could have said, tell us to come. But the rest said, no. So only Peter said, bid me to come. And he said, come. Okay? Now, this is a very interesting exchange. Because in verse 29, Jesus said, come. And Peter stepped out of the boat onto the water and began walking toward Jesus. So how many people have now walked on water? Where is Peter? Where is Jesus? They are not together. But Peter is doing exactly what Jesus is doing based on that invitation to walk on the water. So I must commend Peter for his faith to even believe that it was possible. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because I feel like most people would have just said, if it's you, how do you even identify it? Yeah, if it's you, I don't know. Maybe they would have just waited. Okay? Maybe they would have just waited or tell him, okay, make the water become still because there was a lot of waviness and things going on. But Peter says, no, if it's you, you'll ask me to come and I'm going to come. And so Peter stepped out of the boat onto the water and began walking towards Jesus. I can just imagine in those moments that he took those steps, what that must have felt like, walking on water. Okay? The courage and the faith it takes to do something that you have not seen being done before. Because you see, that's where many of us are trapped. We are trapped in the realms of what's familiar and what's common, what we know, right? But when it comes to doing things that we have not seen being done before, it becomes a challenge for us to believe God that he would help us. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. Like, we only limit our prayers to what we know has been done before, either that we have experienced or we have seen in the life of another person. Rarely do people step out to do that which they have not seen being done before. You understand? And that in itself shows you that our faith still needs to grow up a bit. Do you understand? We need to be able to believe God even for the unpredictable, even for the stuff that's not common, that we've not seen before. You understand? And that's what it means when he says, he will teach us to fly. Do you understand? Not to walk, to fly. He says, those who wait on the Lord will mount up with wings like eagles. You'll do stuff that has not been common in your circle. Not because of you, but because of who you trust. So Peter, it says, Peter stepped out of the boat onto the water and began walking towards Jesus. Now listen to verse 30. But he remembered how strong the wind was, and his courage caught in his throat, and he began to sink. Okay? So he had actually walked on water. He didn't imagine it. He walked on water. But something happened in that moment as he was walking in water. And it says here, he remembered. I like what it says in another version that I put in brackets here. He says, but then he looked down and the waves churning beneath his feet, and he lost his nerve and started to sink. He stepped out. As Jesus was approaching, he was approaching. Where was his gaze? Who was he looking at? Jesus. And every step he took, so long as his eyes were on Jesus, he could walk on water. He says, but the moment he started to think about the waves and the condition of the sea, as this version put, when he looked down at the waves, then he began to sink. At that moment. Because what was sustaining him is not his strength and ability to walk on water. What was sustaining him is that gaze, that connection that he had with God or with Jesus in that moment. That's what made him walk on water. Now, let me give you an interesting thought here to show you that sometimes our reason is far inferior to God's abilities. Listen, if Peter, suppose the water was boisterous, right? There was a storm. Let me ask you this. If the water was not stormy, if the water was calm, do you think Peter would be able to walk on water? It's not. Oh my God. So you think so you think that, okay, if the water is boisterous, he cannot walk, but if the water is calm, he can walk.
Because he will be scared.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. How can he, even if the water is still as milk, how can a human walk on water? Yeah, no, you're right. But it says here, but he remembered how strong the wind was, okay? So I want to take you inside Peter's mind, okay? Because, listen, he believed Jesus. Jesus said, come. And he started walking. What did he think about? The waves. What broke his gaze? The waves. And he started to sink. Because he was thinking about the waves. So if that were true, that it's the waves that were causing him to sink, then does it mean if the water was still, he would have walked on water? No. Because he has no ability. Waves or no waves, he was not walking on the water because of the waves or not the waves. He was walking on the water because his eyes were fixed on. Do you understand what I'm saying? And that speaks a lot to us because sometimes we believe God for what we think is convenient, what's easy, and for the stuff that's messy, okay, we feel like that's too big for God to handle and we give up altogether. You understand? But when you realize that it doesn't matter the kind or the size of the problem, it's the gaze that you hold on the Lord that will take you through everything. Because, you see, Jesus is walking on the same water that's boisterous. I don't know if we are together or if we are lost or if we are confused. Peter stopped walking on water, not because the water was wavy, but because he started to consider it. He started to look at it. He broke his gaze and he started to worry about what was going on. Before that, the water was still the same when he was walking on water. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you get it? Because he's like, no. When the water is still, he'll walk. But no, he wouldn't.
I think he meant that if the water was still and Christ said, come, he would walk.
I still disagree.
But something else would have thought about something else, the vastness of the
Yeah, maybe it'd have been like, oh, this water is too deep. Oh, I don't know how to swim. There is no life jacket. Do you understand what I'm saying? What I'm trying to tell you is, it's never really about the problem. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's never about the problem that you're experiencing. Sometimes we think it is. And we look at the problem and its complexity. And we say, hey, I've seen challenges, but this one is a different one.
I think when it comes to problems, it's a bit like whenever someone is thinking about the problem in a different way than I do, it always has to do something with me. So it's the same with here.
Peter.
So, because Jesus was walking on the water, although it was wavy.
Yeah.
But for him, for Peter, it was a problem, but not for Jesus. So it really depends on how we see things.
Yes, that's true. That's true. It depends on how we see things. Perspective is very, very important. Okay? And we have to maintain this perspective that God is above all. Do you understand? We cannot say that there is a situation. You see, this is funny. If the waves represent our problems and Jesus is walking on them, coming toward us, telling you, come, you have the opportunity to have the same dominion and victory that I have over this thing. Come, look at me. Don't focus on the problem. Look at me. I'm doing it. You can do it too. As you look at me, you become like me. You become what you behold. And in that moment that Peter focused on Jesus, he behaved like Jesus. Do you understand? I don't know if you get the beauty in that scenario. I know eventually he sank, but for a moment, he walked on water. For a moment, he was actually in the same atmosphere, mentally, physically, as Jesus. Like he for a moment experienced what Jesus was experiencing. And that is victory and dominion over all the challenges that were presented to him. I don't know if you get what I'm saying. But the secret was not in the water or his ability to be Peter. Do you understand? Yes, he was a fisherman, but he was still sinking. Do you understand? You would think that he would know his way around. For me, that really was profound, that the things that are affecting us, that are drowning us, that are threatening us, these are the things that he walks on and he presides over and he has dominion over. And he promises you that if you can focus on me, you will continue to have dominion and victory over every challenge. Doesn't matter the size of the wave, doesn't matter the time of the day, doesn't matter the type of sea. The promise is, if you can look, if you can focus, if you can have that perspective. You see, I like what you said about perspective, because we read in Colossians 3:1-3, and he says, see things from his perspective. Do you understand? Because you can look at the waves and like, oh, this is too much. But as Jesus was coming down the mountain, he saw the waves and he didn't go on Airbnb. He walked on the water. You understand what I'm saying? Like, he did not see what was happening as so much as a problem because he was way above whatever was going on in that situation. So he says, see things from his perspective. Do you understand? See things from his perspective. So, anyway, yes. Yes, go on.
I know. So, it's a good question to ask is, how can you keep your mind focused in Jesus?
Okay. Good question. We're going to answer it. It's in the here.
I know where is the answer, but it's more like from me, my advice for this question is it's like a habit. If you do something one time, maybe tomorrow is so hard for you. But if you repeat this kind of things every time, for example, in this case of Jesus, it's a relationship. You create, I don't how to explain that. You create a really focus stronger with him, and don't care what is happening around you, because you are really focused, and anything is distract to you. But it depends how many time you spend with him.
I love that answer. Yeah? She asked the question and she answered it. That's wonderful. All right? We're going to touch on that, but thanks for that. And I think that's very, very important. You know, I think of the time, like, when I came here and, like, maybe I hadn't seen my wife in a long time. I noticed, we were long distance for a while, I noticed this pattern. In the first few days when we meet, like, there's a bit of shyness. You know? Like, it's true. I, you know, some things you experience, but you hadn't not read about it in a book. You know, it's like, so I noticed when we meet, like the first 3 days, 4 days, you can't look at each other so much. You know, you're like, even as a man, you know, and I was like, what's this thing? Oh, eventually it wears off, right? Because you become not familiar, but you become comfortable. Right? Because there's a difference between familiarity and being comfortable. But you become comfortable to be, but it's because by virtue of use and training, as you continue to expose yourself, you know. Oh man, I'm going to read something that's so powerful, but that's the thing, what she said. You might break the gaze once, but don't give up. Lift up your head. Look up. Continue looking. You understand? Continue experiencing. Continue beholding. Do you understand what I'm saying? Don't let one experience. And you see, it's funny because even when Peter sank, Jesus didn't laugh and say, oh, come on, man. Like, what's... No, look, it says, but when he remembered how strong the wind was, you see, Peter's consciousness moved from Jesus to the wind. He moved from Jesus to the waves and the problems. His courage caught in his throat and he began to sink. He says, but when he looked down at the waves churning beneath his feet, he lost his nerve and started to sink. And he said, Master, save me. You see, sometimes, anyway, immediately Jesus reached out for Peter and caught him. Okay? Immediately. Even in his faithlessness. You see, God does not judge you or discriminate against you or forget you because you doubt. No. He doesn't want you to doubt, but even when you doubt, he's still there for you. He says, even when we are unfaithful, he remains faithful because he cannot deny himself. God does not change his nature based on our strengths and weaknesses. So Peter, yes, he doubted, but he said, Jesus said, "O ye of little faith." And he said to him, "Why did you doubt?" It says, you see, and dance back and forth between following me and heeding fear. This was the conversation. Peter was, after the first few steps, he's like, oh, am I going to sink? Am I going to sink? Then he started to sink. That's what happens to us sometimes. God invites you to new opportunities, new things, and we are hesitant either because we've had experiences that affected us negatively, or we've not seen anyone do it and we hesitate, not knowing that the hesitation is what's bringing the downfall. It's not the problem. It's the back and forth. Should I, shouldn't I? Should I, shouldn't I? That is actually what do they call that sand? That's the quicksand. You know? When you are in that place of indecisiveness, will the Lord help me, will he not? That is actually the real problem. It's not what you're facing. You understand what I'm saying? So he says, why did you doubt and dance back and forth between following me and heeding fear? Right. And look at this, very interesting how life works. It says, and Jesus and Peter climbed the boat together and the wind became still. Come on, man. Wind, like after all that, it means the test is over. It was a test for Peter to become like Christ. And he got 50% out of 100. Okay? He passed half. He did well. He did halfway. Okay? But that means there's still room for improvement. And so sometimes, even though God has the ability to fix everything, just like the ego, he's more interested in you developing your capacity to overcome, because it's not the problem. It's never the problem. It's how much trust you have, how much faith you have in God. It's never the issue that you think it is. It's always, how do we view it with respect to who God is? That's always the problem, right? So it says, immediately they climbed into the boat, the wind became still. Like immediately they got in the boat, there were no more waves. But if the waves were the problem, do you think Peter would have been able to go back on the water and do it again? No. Because it was not the waves. Even after they became still, it was not the waves. It was his ability to not doubt and to trust that the one who beckoned him has the ability to sustain him and keep him afloat. After they saw this, the disciples said, truly, you are the Son of God. Now, these are all the ones who never left the boat. They come into the picture. You know, the majority of the people never leave the boat. Forget Peter, who only did half of what he was expected to. Majority of the people don't. Some of the people are still on the land. They're not even in the sea, right? Because they really, really have not exercised that part of them that allows them to believe in God, to trust. You understand? It seems like a risky life, but it's only risky when you don't understand who you're dealing with or who's helping you. You understand what I'm saying? You see, the eagles, they take their young when they want them to fly. And yes, it's risky, but they release them, watching them, and they allow them to learn the dynamics of opening and flapping their wings. until they're able to do so themselves. Why? Because it's crucial for survival. You understand? Remember, this trust that Christ was building in Peter was crucial because he was only going to be there for a limited time. Yet Peter was the one to establish and to continue on with the work that Christ started. It's important to learn how to trust God, even in the simple things. You understand? Even in the things that seem mundane, trust him with it. Build that muscle. Establish that connection. Right? Okay, we need to move forward. Spent a lot of time there. So, again, in the Message version of just what we read in the previous verse, it says, do you see what this means? It says, all these pioneers who blazed the way, all these veterans cheering us on. It says, it means we'd better get on with it. Strip down, start running, never quit. No extra spiritual fat. No parasitic sins. Sorry for the harsh language, but this version is like this. And it says, keep your eyes on Jesus. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished this race we are in. The reason that you will be victorious is because he was victorious. The reason Peter was able to walk on water was because Jesus was already walking in water. So he's not asking you to do what he has not done himself. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's the double guarantee that it's not going to end badly for you. You understand what I'm saying? He says, study how he did it. He says, because he never lost sight of where he was headed. And he says that exhilarating finish in and with God, he says he could put up with anything along the way. It's never the problem. He could put up with anything along the way, whether it's the cross, dying on the cross, whether it's shame, people thinking, man, you must be crazy. And he says, and now he's there in the place of honor right alongside God. And he says, when you find yourself flagging in the faith, you know what flagging the faith is? Like a flag. A flag blows where the wind goes. So a flag is very, very much affected by external conditions. If the wind blows this way, the flag goes this way. He says, when you find yourself flagging in your faith, he says, go over that story again, item by item. Read, internalize. When she's asking, how do you keep your gaze? This is how you do it. Take the scriptures. See how he lived his life. Go over that story. See if Jesus ever talked down on himself. See how he responded to issues. See the kind of mindset he has. Learn his perspective. Learn his language. See how he did it. And he says, that long litany of hostility he plowed through. And he says, that will shoot adrenaline into your souls. As you see how he did it, it imprints the same energy, the same power inside you to go through anything that you think is such a problem. Are we together? Let's go to the next slide. I have a few minutes. And so even beyond overcoming challenges, because sometimes you can think that we are only talking about like physical issues and things that we are facing. Yes, God wants to handle all these things, but beyond that, he wants us to become better. He wants us to become like him. You see, when we talked in identity, we said that we are made in the image and likeness of God. But at the fall, we were deceived and believed that there is something that we have lost, and we changed our perspective and lost sight of our identity. Jesus came to bring reconciliation, in that he came to restore our true nature and our true identity of who we are and who we are in God. So we see here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16 to 18. I love it. It says, nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, in other words, when one looks away to Jesus, when one starts to believe, when one goes back to that relationship with God, he says the veil is taken away. Because you see, for most people, there is a veil. We said previously that the God of this world, speaking of Satan, has blinded their minds, that they cannot see the light of the gospel. Do you understand? That many people walk this life with a veil on their heads, that they cannot see really what is real and what's not. And that's why people become so vulnerable and susceptible to the pressures of life. Not because they are weak, but because they're blinded. Okay? So it says here, nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. And he says, now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. That's one characteristic of how you know the Lord is around you. You will feel free. You understand what I'm saying? You'll feel a certain sense of liberty. Because it says where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. How many of us feel liberty when we come to Manifest? Yeah, there we go. Because that's his nature. He says, he who the Son sets free is free indeed. And he says, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. In other words, the veil will be taken away. One of the events that took place when Jesus was crucified, many events took place, but one very special one is that the veil that was at the temple was rent from top to bottom. You see, the veil was a long cloth that separated the inner court of the temple from the outer court. And it was really thick. It was more like a carpet than a veil. Really thick. And if you think about it, it says the veil was rent from top to bottom. How could that happen? It's a miraculous event because if it was someone who was going to do it, they would tear it from the bottom to top. If I want to tear this, it's going to be very difficult for me to start from the top. It's easier for me to cut from the... Yeah, but it says it was torn, the veil, representing the thing that kept us from having a clear image, a clear view of who God is. And he says here, the veil is taken away, and he says, but we all, with unveiled face. You see, the relationship between Christ and the church is also described as the relationship between a man and a woman. What happens when the vows are exchanged? Before he says, you may kiss the bride, what does he say? Or what does he do? What do? They take off the veil. You understand? It's symbolic. I don't know. Hey, we need to attend weddings, guys. What's this? Yeah, okay, let me tell you then, instead of asking. When at a wedding, okay, the bride usually has, and then there's something covering. And at that time when the vows have been exchanged and all of this, the veil is taken away. It's symbolic that now there is permission to interact without any, to be as intimate as possible. Can you imagine kissing through the veil? A bit gross, right? All right? He says the veil has been taken away. And listen, guys. So, but now with unveiled faces, the veil has been taken away. He says, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. So you're looking at his face. And he says, are being transformed into the same image. So as you look to him, you are being made what he is. Just as Peter experienced that for a moment, as he looked to him and walked on water, he says, as you look to him, you are being transformed into the same image. And he says, from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. This is such a powerful lesson to learn for us in our lives, that we must maintain that Godward gaze. We must continue to look intently at him. Not with these eyes, but that your attention, your trust, your hope would be on the one who is really able to help you. So it says here in 2 Corinthians 3:16-18 in the Message version, it says, whenever, though they turn to face God as Moses did, it says God removes their veil and they are face to face. And he says they suddenly recognize that God is a living personal presence, not a piece of chiseled stone. Because that's what you realize when you begin to interact with God, is that he is a living presence. He's there. You understand? And he says, when God is personally present, a living spirit, that old constricting legislation is recognized as obsolete. That means when you come into that experience with God, all those things and mental obstacles that existed between you and God, they melt away because you realize none of them were real. You understand? And he says here that we are free of it, all of us, nothing between us and God. He says, and our faces shining with the brightness of his face. And he says, so we are transfigured, much like the Messiah, that is Christ. He says, our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful as God enters our lives and we become like him. This is what Peter experienced. That's how he was able to walk on water. It was not in his ability, but as his gaze was focused toward Christ, he says he became more like him. He was able to do what Christ was able to do. And so it is with us even today. As you have a Godward gaze, a focus on him, your attention, your thoughts, seeing and using your imagination to experience everything that the scriptures tell you, he says you will become more and more like him. And even if you break that gaze, it's not the end. Just look up again. It's simple as that, you know. You don't have to beat yourself down because you feel like, oh, I've already lived so much of my life without... Listen, you're very, very young. You have so many years to prove the goodness of God. You have so many years to believe, to see the goodness of God. And as you see, as you look, as you focus your intention, your attention on him, he says you become more like him. Whatever you thought was a problem, whatever you thought was holding you back, whatever you thought was limiting you, suddenly has no more power over you. Why is this true? It says in 1 John chapter 4, it says, because as he is, so are we in this world. As he is, present tense, so are you in this world. But the degree to which we accept and believe this truth varies. For some of us, we are only able to trust God in the familiar, in the knowable, in the common. But he's asking us to step out of the boat, to take that step, to learn to fly, not just to walk or run. He says there's more that he wants to show us than we ever thought was possible. We read last week Jeremiah 33:3. He says, call unto me and I will show you great and mighty things which you know nothing about. You understand? Your walk with God does not have to be common. It doesn't have to be predictable. It doesn't have to be regular. There is so much more in him if only you would focus and allow him to be transmitted into you. Allow yourself to become like what you behold. In Jesus' name. I think that's the end of the message. And I'm going to close in prayer. But I want you to think about the things that we've said when you go home. Check if they are true. And see the areas in our lives that maybe God is not the focus anymore. Or his help is not our focus. Maybe we feel like, oh, maybe that guy will help me, or that person will help me. But you know sometimes by experience that humans, they let us down too many times. But if your trust is in God, he said, listen, you don't stand a chance of being disappointed.